Sarah Martinez stepped off the military transport bus at Camp Pendleton, her boots hitting the dusty ground with determination. The California sun blazed overhead as she shouldered her heavy duffel bag and looked around at the sprawling Marine base that would be her home for the next several months. At 22 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight frame that made her look more like a college student than someone who had just completed Marine Corps boot camp. The other recruits around her were mostly men, their voices loud and confident as they joked with each other and talked about their families back home. Sarah kept quiet, observing everything with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. She had learned early in life that watching and listening taught you more than talking ever could. As they were directed toward the barracks, Sarah noticed the sideways glances from her fellow Marines. Some looked curious, others skeptical. A few openly smirked when they saw her struggling slightly with the weight of her gear. She had packed everything regulation required, plus a few personal items that reminded her of home. A small photo of her grandmother, a worn rosary, and a letter from her younger brother who looked up to her more than anyone else in the world. Staff Sergeant Johnson, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, stood at attention as the new arrivals gathered in formation. His voice boomed across the courtyard as he began the orientation speech that every new Marine had heard variations of for decades. But when his eyes fell on Sarah, she noticed a slight pause, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. "Martinez," he called out, reading from his clipboard. "Sarah Martinez." "Yes, sir," she responded, her voice clear and strong despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. Johnson looked her up and down, taking in her small stature and youthful appearance. "You sure you're in the right place, recruit? The Army base is about 20 miles that way." A few of the other Marines chuckled at his comment. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, sir. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The staff sergeant nodded slowly, making a note on his clipboard. "We'll see about that, Martinez. We'll see about that." That first night in the barracks, Sarah lay on her narrow bunk listening to the conversations flowing around her. Her bunkmate, a loud guy from Texas named Rodriguez, was regaling anyone who would listen with stories about his high school football career and how he was going to be the best Marine the Corps had ever seen. Across the room, Thompson and Williams were comparing their bench press records and debating whether Sarah would make it through the first week of training. "I give her 3 days," Thompson whispered, thinking Sarah was asleep. "She looks like a strong wind would knock her over." "That's generous," Williams replied. "I'm betting she's crying and calling home by tomorrow night." Sarah pulled her thin military blanket over her head and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind drifted back to the reason she had joined the Marines in the first place. Growing up in a small town in New Mexico, she had been the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Her father had left when she was 8, and her mother, Maria, had raised Sarah and her younger brother Carlos with an iron will and endless love. Money had always been tight in the Martinez household. Sarah remembered wearing hand-me-down clothes and shoes with holes in them, but her mother had always made sure they had what they needed for school. Education was everything to Maria Martinez, who had dropped out of high school when she became pregnant with Sarah and had regretted it ever since. "Mija," her mother would say, "you have to be twice as good as everyone else to get half of what they have. But you're strong enough to do it. You come from a long line of strong women." Sarah's grandmother, Elena, had been the strongest woman she had ever known. Elena had immigrated to the United States from Mexico with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to build a better life for her family. She had worked in fields, cleaned houses, and saved every penny she could to buy a small piece of land where she grew vegetables to sell at the local market. It was Elena who had first called Sarah Little Wolf when she was just a child. "You watch everything, Mija," her grandmother would say. "You wait, you plan, and when the time is right, you strike." That's what wolves do. They're patient, they're smart, and they never give up. When Elena passed away during Sarah's senior year of high school, she had left her granddaughter a small inheritance, just enough to help with college or trade school. But Sarah had bigger dreams. She wanted to serve her country, to prove that someone from her background could excel in the toughest military branch, and to earn the education benefits that would eventually help her become the first person in her family to graduate from college. The next morning came early with the harsh sound of reveille echoing through the barracks. Sarah was already awake, having learned to rise before the official wake-up call during her time at boot camp. As the other Marines stumbled out of their bunks, she was already dressed and making her bed with crisp, military precision. The day began with physical training, and it was here that the first real test of Sarah's resolve would come. The Marines were divided into groups for a 5-mile run, and Sarah found herself placed with the men rather than separated into a smaller female group. Staff Sergeant Johnson explained that they were short-staffed and everyone would train together. As they lined up at the starting line, Sarah could feel the eyes of her fellow Marines on her. Some looked sympathetic, others amused, and a few seemed genuinely curious to see what would happen. Rodriguez, her bunkmate, leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry if you can't keep up, Martinez. No one expects you to run with the big boys." The whistle blew, and the group took off at a steady pace that quickly separated the strong runners from the struggling ones. Sarah found her rhythm early, her breathing controlled, and her stride efficient. She had been running since she was 12 years old, when her mother couldn't afford to buy her a bus pass, and she had to run the 3 miles to school and back every day. Mile after mile, Marines began to fall back from the lead group, their breathing labored and their faces red with exertion. But Sarah maintained her position, staying with the middle of the pack and showing no signs of distress. Her small frame worked to her advantage here. She carried less weight, and her body was naturally efficient at distance running. By the 4th mile, several of the larger Marines were walking, unable to maintain the pace. Thompson, who had been so confident the night before, was doubled over on the side of the trail, clutching his side and gasping for air. Williams had dropped out at mile 3, his face pale and sweat pouring down his forehead. Sarah passed them both without a word, her focus entirely on the path ahead of her. She could hear Rodriguez somewhere behind her, his breathing harsh and irregular. The Marine who had been so certain of his own abilities was struggling to keep up with the little girl he had dismissed so casually. As they approached the final mile, Staff Sergeant Johnson ran alongside the remaining group, shouting encouragement and criticism in equal measure. When he pulled up next to Sarah, she expected some comment about her performance or her pace. Instead, he simply ran beside her for a few hundred yards, observing her form and her breathing. "Where'd you learn to run like that, Martinez?" he asked, his voice carrying easily despite the exertion. "New Mexico, sir," she replied, not wasting breath on unnecessary words. "Long way from home," Johnson noted. "Yes, sir." He nodded and dropped back to check on the other Marines, but not before Sarah caught something that might have been approval in his expression. When they crossed the finish line, Sarah was in the top third of the group, having outlasted Marines who were twice her size and supposedly much stronger. She wasn't the fastest, but she had finished strong while others had fallen by the wayside. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she belonged here. As the Marines cooled down and prepared for the next phase of training, Sarah noticed that the conversations had changed slightly. There were fewer jokes about her size and more curious glances at the small woman who had just outrun half of their unit. Rodriguez, who had barely made it across the finish line, looked at her with something approaching respect. "Not bad for a little girl," he said, though his tone was more admiring than condescending. Sarah simply nodded and began stretching, preparing her body for whatever challenge would come next. She knew that one good run wouldn't change everything, but it was a start. In her mind, she could hear her grandmother's voice reminding her that wolves were patient, that they proved themselves through actions rather than words. The rest of that first week would bring more challenges, obstacle courses, weapons training, and the constant pressure of military life. But Sarah Martinez had taken the first step toward earning something more valuable than acceptance. She was beginning to earn respect, 1 mile at a time. The obstacle course at Camp Pendleton was designed to break down Marines and build them back up stronger. Sarah stood at the starting line on a gray Monday morning, studying the intimidating series of challenges that stretched out before her like a gauntlet of wood, rope, and steel. Walls to climb, ropes to traverse, mud pits to crawl through, and barriers designed to test every muscle in the human body. Staff Sergeant Johnson walked the line of Marines, his boots crunching on the gravel as he inspected each recruit. When he reached Sarah, he paused longer than usual, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air. "You know what the record is for this course?" "No, sir," Sarah replied, her eyes fixed straight ahead. 12 minutes, 37 seconds. Set by a Marine who weighed 220 pounds and stood 6 feet 3 inches tall. Johnson stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Sarah could hear. "Some of these obstacles were built with a certain type of Marine in mind. You understand what I'm saying?" Sarah understood perfectly. The obstacles were designed for larger, stronger Marines. The rope climb required significant upper body strength. The wall climbs demanded reach and power. The heavy carry at the end assumed a Marine who could shoulder substantial weight without breaking down. "Understand, sir," she said simply. "Good. Because I don't want to hear any excuses when you don't make time. This isn't about fairness, Martinez. It's about capability." As Johnson moved on to the next Marine, Sarah continued studying the course. She had learned from her grandmother that there was always more than one way to solve a problem. While others might rely on brute strength, she would have to be smarter, more efficient, and more determined. The first Marine up was Thompson, who had recovered from his poor showing on the 5-mile run and was eager to prove himself. At 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, he looked like he had been built specifically for this type of challenge. He attacked the course with raw power, muscling his way over walls and charging through obstacles. His time was solid 14 minutes, 12 seconds. Williams went next, followed by Rodriguez and several others. Each Marine brought their own approach, but most relied on the same basic strategy of overwhelming the obstacles with strength and speed. Times range from just under 14 minutes to over 20 minutes for those who struggled with the rope climbs and heavy carries. Then it was Sarah's turn. She approached the first obstacle, a 6-foot wooden wall, and immediately saw the problem. The wall was designed for Marines to grab the top edge and pull themselves up using upper body strength. At her height, Sarah could barely reach the top edge, even jumping. But she had noticed something during her observation time that the others had missed. There was a slight depression in the ground on the left side of the wall, created by years of Marines landing in the same spot. Sarah used this depression to get extra height on her jump, then used her leg strength to walk up the wall face while maintaining her grip on the top edge. It wasn't the powerful pull-up that most Marines used, but it got her over the obstacle efficiently. The rope traverse came next. 30 feet of thick rope stretched between two platforms, with a mud pit 20 feet below. Most Marines pulled themselves across hand over hand, their body weight making the rope sag and increasing the difficulty. Sarah tried a different approach. She had spent summers helping her uncle repair roofs back in New Mexico, and she understood how to distribute weight and use momentum. Instead of hanging below the rope, she got on top of it, wrapping her legs around it, and using a technique that was part monkey walk, part tightrope balance. It required incredible core strength and balance, but it was much faster than the hand-over-hand method. Watching from below, several Marines stopped what they were doing to stare. Johnson checked his stopwatch and made a note on his clipboard. "What the hell is she doing up there?" Rodriguez muttered to Williams. "I don't know, but it's working," Williams replied, watching Sarah reach the far platform in record time. The mud crawl was next. 50 yards of barbed wire stretched 18 inches above a pit of thick, cold mud. Marines had to crawl on their bellies, keeping low enough to avoid the wire while moving as quickly as possible through the muck. This obstacle favored smaller, more compact Marines, and Sarah excelled. She had grown up playing in the arroyos and creek beds of New Mexico, and crawling through tight spaces was second nature to her. While larger Marines struggled to keep their backs low enough to clear the wire, Sarah moved through the obstacle like water flowing downhill, her small frame and natural flexibility serving her well. Emerging from the mud pit, Sarah was covered from head to toe in thick, brown muck, but she had shaved precious seconds off her time. The heavy carry awaited at the end, a 100-pound sandbag that had to be carried 50 yards in a fireman's carry. This was the obstacle that Johnson had been thinking about when he warned Sarah about the course design. 100 pounds was significant for anyone, but for someone Sarah's size, it represented a serious challenge. She watched as the Marines before her had approached it, most simply shouldered the bag and powered through with determination and strength. Sarah knew she didn't have the raw power to match their approach, but she had something else: technique and experience. Growing up, she had helped her mother and grandmother carry heavy bags of vegetables, sacks of flour, and other supplies. She had learned that the key was not just strength, but balance, leverage, and pacing. She positioned the sandbag differently than the others had, finding the exact center of balance and adjusting her grip to distribute the weight more efficiently. Instead of trying to run with the bag, she moved in a steady, measured pace that she knew she could maintain for the full 50 yards. Step by step, Sarah crossed the distance while other Marines who had started strong began to stumble and falter under the weight. Her legs burned and her lungs screamed for air, but she kept moving forward, drawing on reserves of determination that had been built over years of struggle and hardship. When she finally set the sandbag down at the finish line, Staff Sergeant Johnson was waiting with his stopwatch. "Time," he called out, then looked at his watch with an expression of disbelief. 13 minutes, 58 seconds. A murmur went through the watching Marines. Sarah had not only completed the course, she had posted one of the best times of the day. More importantly, she had done it using techniques and approaches that none of them had considered. "How did you do that rope traverse?" asked a Marine named Jackson, approaching Sarah as she tried to clean some of the mud from her uniform. "Just found a way that worked for me," Sarah replied, not wanting to make a big show of her success. But word spread quickly through the unit about the small Marine who had beaten the obstacle course using brain instead of brawn. Conversations that had started with skepticism began to shift toward curiosity and grudging respect. That evening in the mess hall, Sarah found herself sitting with a different group of Marines than usual. Instead of being ignored or barely tolerated, she was being asked questions about her background, her training, and her techniques. Rodriguez, who had been among the most skeptical, sat down across from her with his dinner tray. "Martinez, I gotta ask, where did you learn a move like that? That wasn't standard Marine Corps technique." "I learned to adapt," Sarah said simply. "Where I come from, you use what you have, and you make it work." "Where exactly do you come from?" asked Williams, genuine curiosity in his voice. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Sarah opened up slightly about her background. She told them about growing up in a small New Mexico town where resources were scarce and creativity was essential. She talked about helping her family with physical labor from a young age, about learning to solve problems without having all the advantages that others took for granted. "My grandmother used to say that wolves don't succeed because they're the biggest or the strongest," Sarah explained. "They succeed because they're smart, they work together, and they never give up." Thompson, who had been quietly listening, looked up from his food. "Is that why you joined the Marines? To prove something?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I joined to serve my country and to build a better life for my family. But, yeah, maybe part of it is proving that someone like me belongs here." The conversation continued long into the evening, with Marines sharing their own stories and motivations. For the first time since arriving, Sarah felt like she was becoming part of the unit rather than just an outsider trying to fit in. But not everyone was ready to accept her success. Later that night, as Sarah prepared for sleep, she overheard a conversation from the next row of bunks. "I don't care what her time was," a voice she recognized as Marine Davis was saying. "She's still just a small-town girl who's going to crack under real pressure. The obstacle course isn't combat. Wait until things get serious. Maybe, replied another voice. But did you see the way she handled that rope traverse? That wasn't luck. That was skill. Skill doesn't stop bullets, Davis responded. When we're in a real fight, I want Marines next to me who can carry their weight and mine if necessary. I'm not sure she can do that. Sarah lay in her bunk, listening to the debate about her capabilities and her future. She understood Davis's concerns. They weren't entirely unfair. In combat, Marines depended on each other for survival, and physical capability was often a matter of life and death. But she also knew that she had proven something important that day. She had shown that there were different ways to be strong, different ways to succeed, and different ways to contribute to the mission. The obstacle course had been her first real opportunity to demonstrate that being smaller didn't mean being weaker. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah thought about the challenges that lay ahead. She had passed one test, but she knew there would be many more. Each day would bring new opportunities to prove herself and new chances to earn the respect of her fellow Marines. In her dreams that night, she was running through the desert landscapes of her childhood, her grandmother's voice echoing across the sagebrush and sand. Patience, little wolf. Show them who you really are one step at a time. The desert training exercise was scheduled to begin at dawn, but Sarah had been awake since 3 in the morning, checking and rechecking her equipment in the dim light of the barracks. 72 hours in the Mojave Desert with limited water, minimal food, and a series of tactical objectives that would test everything the Marines had learned during their months of training. Staff Sergeant Johnson stood before the assembled unit in the pre-dawn darkness, his figure barely visible against the star-filled sky. The temperature was already dropping toward what would be a bitter cold night, and by afternoon it would climb past 100 degrees. The desert didn't forgive mistakes, and Marines who couldn't adapt would find themselves in serious trouble. This exercise will separate the Marines from the wannabes, Johnson announced, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. You'll be working in teams of 4, and every team member must complete every objective. If one person fails, the entire team fails. Sarah felt her stomach clench as she heard the team assignments being read aloud. She was paired with Davis, the Marine who had been most vocal about his doubts regarding her abilities, along with Rodriguez and a quiet Marine named Chun who had consistently performed well, but rarely spoke during group discussions. Davis's reaction was immediate and visible. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see his shoulders sag with disappointment. Rodriguez looked between Sarah and Davis, clearly anticipating tension. Chun simply nodded, accepting the assignment without comment. Martinez, Davis said as they gathered their gear, his voice carefully controlled, but obviously frustrated. I need to know right now, are you going to be able to keep up out there? Because if you can't, you need to speak up now before we're all stuck paying for it. Sarah met his gaze directly, her own voice calm and steady. I'll keep up. Keeping up on a training course is different from keeping up in the desert with a full pack and combat gear, Davis continued. We're talking about 72 hours of hell, and I'm not interested in playing babysitter. Rodriguez stepped between them before the conversation could escalate further. Look, we're a team whether we like it or not. Let's figure out how to make this work instead of arguing about it. Chin spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. Davis, she's been here as long as the rest of us. She's earned her place. Martinez, Davis has a point about the desert being different. It's going to be brutal for everyone. The team spent the next hour reviewing their objectives and planning their approach. They would need to navigate 15 miles across difficult terrain, establish 3 separate communication checkpoints, complete a night patrol exercise, and finish with a simulated combat scenario, all while carrying 60-pound packs and managing their water and food supplies carefully enough to last the full 3 days. As the sun began to rise over the desert mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red, the teams dispersed to their starting points. Sarah's team drew a particularly challenging route that would take them through rocky terrain, across a dry lake bed, and up into the foothills where the final objective waited. The first few hours went smoothly. The early morning air was cool, and the Marines settled into a steady pace that ate up the miles efficiently. Sarah had positioned herself second in the line, behind Chun, who was serving as navigator, with Rodriguez and Davis following. She had learned that being in the middle of the formation often provided the most stability for a team. But as the sun climbed higher and the temperature began to soar, the challenges mounted. The weight of the pack, which had seemed manageable in the cool morning air, became oppressive as they climbed through rocky terrain under the blazing sun. The landscape was beautiful, but unforgiving, all sharp rocks, thorny vegetation, and endless expanses of sand and stone. By noon, when they stopped for their first scheduled rest, Davis was already showing signs of heat exhaustion. His face was flushed red, and his breathing was labored. Rodriguez wasn't much better, and even Chun was moving more slowly than usual. Sarah, despite being the smallest member of the team, appeared to be handling the conditions better than the others. Growing up in New Mexico had prepared her for desert heat, and her smaller size meant she lost less water through sweating. More importantly, she had learned from childhood to pace herself and conserve energy for the long haul. "How are you not dying out here?" Rodriguez asked, pouring precious water over his head to cool down. "I grew up in this," Sarah replied, carefully measuring out her water ration for the midday break. "My grandmother used to say that the desert teaches you respect. You don't fight it, you work with it." Davis looked at her skeptically. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sarah pointed to the way she had set up her rest position, using her pack and the natural shade of a large rock to create a cooler microenvironment. "You find ways to make it easier. You pay attention to what your body needs. You don't waste energy fighting things you can't change." As they prepared to continue the march, Sarah noticed that Davis was drinking water too quickly, already nearly halfway through his daily ration despite having hours of travel ahead. She debated whether to say something, knowing that unsolicited advice would likely be poorly received. Finally, she decided that team success was more important than avoiding conflict. "Davis," she said quietly, "you might want to slow down on the water. We got 8 more hours before we can refill." Davis's response was sharp and immediate. "I can manage my own water, thanks. Worry about keeping up instead of bothering me." Rodriguez and Chun exchanged glances, but neither commented. They resumed their march across the increasingly brutal landscape, with the sun now directly overhead and no shade in sight. 2 hours later, the consequences of Davis's water management became apparent. He began stumbling, his pace slowing dramatically as dehydration took hold. His skin was dry and flushed, and he was no longer sweating despite the extreme heat. "Davis," Chin called out, "we need to stop." "I'm fine," Davis insisted, but his voice was slurred and he was weaving as he walked. Sarah moved up to walk alongside him, studying his condition with growing concern. She had seen heat exhaustion before. It was a common problem during the hot New Mexico summers, especially among people who weren't used to the climate. "Davis, you need to sit down and cool off," she said firmly. "This isn't optional." "Don't tell me what to do," Davis snapped, but even as he spoke, his legs buckled and he nearly fell. Rodriguez caught him and helped him to a sitting position in the shade of a large boulder. Chun broke out the emergency medical kit while Sarah began implementing the heat injury protocols they had all learned during their medical training. She poured water from her own ration onto a bandana and placed it on Davis's neck, then began fanning him with a piece of cardboard from the medical kit packaging. "Chun, we need to get his core temperature down. Rodriguez, can you create some more shade with the ponchos?" For the next 30 minutes, Sarah took charge of treating Davis's heat exhaustion, using techniques she had learned both in Marine training and from years of living in similar conditions. She monitored his pulse, managed his cooling, and carefully rationed water to help him rehydrate without overwhelming his system. Gradually, Davis's condition improved. His skin regained normal color, his pulse steadied, and he began thinking clearly again. When he finally looked up at Sarah, who had been monitoring him constantly throughout his recovery, His expression was different than it had been before. "You probably saved my life," he said quietly. "You would have done the same for me," Sarah replied. "Maybe, but you knew what to do immediately. That wasn't just Marine training. You've dealt with this before." Sarah nodded. "My little brother had heat stroke when he was 12. Scared us all to death, but my grandmother knew exactly what to do. She made sure I learned too." The team resumed their march, but the dynamic had shifted. Davis stayed closer to Sarah, accepting her suggestions about pace and water management without argument. Rodriguez began asking her questions about desert survival techniques. Even Chun, who rarely initiated conversations, wanted to know more about her background and experience. That night, as they established their patrol base for the second phase of the exercise, the team worked together with a cohesion that hadn't existed before. Davis apologized for his earlier dismissive attitude, admitting that his pride had nearly cost him his health and potentially compromised the entire mission. "I was wrong about you," he said as they shared a cold meal of military rations. "I thought being small meant being weak. But you got skills the rest of us don't have, and you kept your head when things got serious." "We all have different strengths," Sarah replied. "That's what makes a team work." The night patrol exercise tested different skills: stealth, navigation in darkness, and tactical movement. Here again, Sarah's smaller size proved advantageous. She could move more quietly than the others, and her natural patience served her well during the long periods of observation and waiting that tactical operations required. When they encountered the enemy patrol during their night movement, it was Sarah who spotted them first and guided the team around their position without being detected. Her eyes had adapted to the darkness better than the others, and her childhood experience moving through desert terrain at night gave her confidence that the others lacked. By the final day of the exercise, when they reached the simulated combat scenario, Sarah had become the unofficial tactical leader of the team. Davis, Rodriguez, and Chen all deferred to her judgment on matters of desert operations, while she relied on their strengths in areas like communications and heavy weapons handling. The combat scenario required the team to assault a fortified position, extract a simulated casualty, and evacuate under fire. It was physically demanding and tactically complex, requiring all 4 Marines to work together seamlessly. Sarah's role in the assault was to provide covering fire while the others moved, then advanced to help with the casualty evacuation. When Rodriguez was designated as the wounded Marine for the scenario, it fell to the remaining 3 to get him to the extraction point, a task that would normally require significant physical strength. But Sarah had observed how the rescue had been handled by other teams, and she suggested a different approach. Instead of trying to carry Rodriguez in the traditional fireman's carry, they used a technique she had learned from her uncle who worked in construction, a 4-handed carry that distributed the weight more effectively and allowed for faster movement. The innovation worked perfectly, allowing them to complete the evacuation in record time while maintaining effective covering fire. When the exercise concluded and Staff Sergeant Johnson announced their results, Sarah's team had achieved the highest overall score of any group in their class. But more important than the scores was what had happened within the team itself. For Marines who had started the exercise as reluctant partners had become a cohesive unit that trusted and depended on each other. As they cleaned their weapons and prepared for the ride back to base, Davis approached Sarah one final time. "I owe you an apology that's bigger than what I said yesterday," he began. "I judged you based on what I thought a Marine should look like instead of what you could actually do. That was wrong, and it was stupid." Sarah accepted his handshake and his apology with grace, but she was already thinking ahead to the next challenge. She had proven that she belonged in the Marines, but she knew that each new situation would require her to prove herself again. That night, as they drove back through the desert darkness toward Camp Pendleton, Sarah looked out at the stars that hung like diamonds over the landscape that had tested her so thoroughly. She had faced doubt, overcome physical challenges, and earned the respect of Marines who had initially dismissed her. But she also understood that this was just the beginning. The desert exercise had been preparation for real deployments, real missions, and real combat where the stakes would be much higher than training scores and peer acceptance. In her pocket, she carried a letter from her mother that had been waiting for her before the exercise began. "Mija," it read, "your brother talks about you every day. He tells everyone his sister is a Marine. Make us proud, but more importantly, come home safe." As the lights of the base appeared in the distance, Sarah thought about home, about family, and about the path that had led her to this point. She had started as the newcomer that everyone laughed at, but she was becoming something else, something stronger, more capable, and more confident. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Sarah felt like she truly belonged. The deployment orders arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered with the crisp efficiency that marked all significant military communications. Sarah Martinez, now 3 months into her advanced infantry training and carrying the rank of Lance Corporal, read the document twice before the reality fully settled in. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, a place where the war was not theoretical but devastatingly real. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as Staff Sergeant Johnson outlined their mission. They would be part of a forward operating base tasked with training Afghan National Army units and conducting joint patrols in an area known for heavy Taliban activity. The deployment would last 9 months, and there was no guarantee that everyone who shipped out would return home. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of Marines who had become more than fellow soldiers over the past months. Davis sat 2 rows ahead, his earlier skepticism about her abilities long since replaced by genuine respect and friendship. Rodriguez was taking detailed notes, his usual joking demeanor replaced by focused attention. Chun maintained his characteristic quiet intensity, but Sarah could see the weight of the announcement in his posture. "Martinez," Johnson called out as the briefing concluded and Marines began filing out of the room. "Hold back a minute." Sarah waited as the room emptied, wondering if this conversation would be about her readiness for deployment or some administrative issue she had overlooked. Johnson studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You know this isn't going to be like the training exercises," he said. "Out there, when things go bad, they go bad fast. And some people are going to have opinions about having a woman on combat patrols." "Understand, sir," Sarah replied. "Do you? Because I'm not just talking about the enemy. I'm talking about some of our own people. Not everyone has had the chance to see what you can do like our unit has. You're going to have to prove yourself all over again, probably more than once." Sarah nodded, appreciating Johnson's directness. "I'm ready for that, sir." "I believe you are. But ready and prepared are different things." Johnson pulled a folder from his desk and handed it to her. "These are after-action reports from female Marines who have deployed to similar positions. Read them. Learn from their experiences." "And Martinez." "Yes, sir. Don't lose what makes you effective just to prove a point. You've earned your place here by being smart, adaptable, and tough. Don't try to be something you're not just because someone questions whether you belong." That evening, Sarah sat on her bunk reading through the reports Johnson had given her. The stories were both inspiring and sobering. Women who had excelled in combat roles, who had saved lives, and completed missions that others thought impossible. But also accounts of the additional scrutiny, the constant need to prove worthiness, and the physical and emotional toll of operating in an environment where every decision was viewed through the lens of gender. One report particularly caught her attention. It was written by a Marine named Captain Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to her teammate, who had led mixed gender patrols in Iraq. Her advice was simple but profound. Don't try to be one of the boys. Be the best Marine you can be. Your gender is only a limitation if you make it one. The weeks leading up to deployment passed quickly, filled with specialized training, medical preparations, and the 1,000 small details that accompanied overseas assignment. Sarah threw herself into the preparation with characteristic intensity, spending extra time on marksmanship, combat medical training, and language lessons in basic Pashto. During a particularly challenging urban warfare exercise, she found herself paired with a Marine she hadn't worked with before, Staff Sergeant Williams, who had just transferred to their unit from another base. Williams had a reputation as an excellent soldier, but old-school attitudes about women in combat roles. The exercise simulated clearing a multi-story building held by enemy forces, with Marines required to work in pairs to systematically search and secure each room. Sarah and Williams were assigned to the second floor, a complex layout with multiple rooms and several potential ambush points. Williams made his expectations clear from the start. "I lead, you follow. Stay back and provide covering fire. Don't try to be a hero." Sarah agreed without argument, understanding that this wasn't the time to debate tactics. But when they encountered their first simulated enemy position, an instructor hiding behind furniture with a training weapon, Williams's approach proved problematic. He tried to assault the position directly, using his size and strength to overpower the defender. But the room layout didn't favor that approach, and the enemy Marine had positioning that made Williams's charge ineffective. After 3 failed attempts that would have resulted in casualties in a real situation, the instructor called a halt. "Williams, you're dead 3 times over," the instructor announced. "You need a new approach." Sarah studied the room layout, noting details that Williams had missed in his aggressive approach. There was a window that provided an alternative angle, furniture that could be used for concealment, and a blind spot that could be exploited with proper positioning. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, "what if we try a different approach?" Williams's initial reaction was dismissive. "Such as?" Sarah outlined her observations and suggested a coordinated approach that would use misdirection and superior positioning rather than brute force. Williams listened with obvious skepticism, but agreed to try her suggestion. The modified approach worked perfectly. While Williams provided suppressing fire from one position, Sarah maneuvered through the room using concealment and reached an angle that allowed her to neutralize the target without exposing either Marine to return fire. The instructor nodded approvingly, and they moved on to the next objective. By the end of the exercise, Williams had seen enough to reconsider his assumptions about Sarah's capabilities. During the after-action review, he publicly acknowledged that her tactical suggestions had been superior to his initial approach. "Martinez," he said as they cleaned their weapons, "I may have been wrong about the best way to use your skills." "We all have different strengths," Sarah replied, offering the same response she had given Davis months earlier. "True, but some people are better at seeing the whole picture than others. You've got good tactical sense." Word of Sarah's performance in the urban warfare exercise spread quickly through the unit, adding to her growing reputation as a Marine who could think under pressure and contribute effectively to any mission. But she also understood that reputation would mean nothing once they deployed. In Afghanistan, she would have to prove herself again under conditions where mistakes had permanent consequences. The night before departure, Sarah video called her family back in New Mexico. Her mother looked older than she remembered, worry lines more pronounced around her eyes. Her brother Carlos, now 15, had grown several inches and spoke with a voice that cracked between high and low registers. "Are you scared?" Carlos asked, the question hanging heavy between them despite the casual tone he tried to maintain. Sarah considered lying, offering the kind of confident reassurance that would ease his worry. Instead, she chose honesty. "Yes, I'm scared, but I'm also ready. And I'm going with good Marines who will watch out for each other. Promise me you'll be careful," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise I'll be smart, and I'll remember everything you and Abuela taught me." That night, as Sarah packed her final gear and prepared for the long journey to Afghanistan, she thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a newcomer that everyone laughed at, the small woman who didn't fit their image of what a Marine should be. Now she was deploying to a combat zone with Marines who trusted her judgment and relied on her skills. Davis had specifically requested to be on her team for patrol assignments. Rodriguez regularly sought her advice on tactical problems. Even Williams, initially skeptical, had come to value her contributions. But Sarah also understood that the real test was still ahead. Training exercises, no matter how realistic, couldn't fully prepare anyone for the reality of combat. In Afghanistan, she would face not just the physical challenges of military operations, but also the psychological pressure of life and death decisions made under extreme stress. As she lay in her bunk for the last time at Camp Pendleton, Sarah thought about her grandmother's words about wolves. Elena had always emphasized that wolves succeeded not because they were the largest or strongest, but because they were smart, patient, and loyal to their pack. In a few hours, Sarah would board a transport plane that would take her halfway around the world to a place where those qualities would be tested in ways she could only imagine. She would face dangers that could kill her, challenges that might break her, and responsibilities that would define the rest of her life. But she would also have the opportunity to prove that strength came in many forms, that effectiveness was more important than size, and that a small woman from New Mexico could excel in one of the world's most demanding professions. The nickname Iron Wolf had started as a joke among Marines who couldn't reconcile her appearance with her performance. But somewhere during her months of training, the joke had evolved into something else, a recognition of the unique combination of mental toughness, tactical intelligence, and unwavering determination that Sarah brought to every challenge. As the base settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Sarah Martinez closed her eyes and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would begin the next chapter of her journey, one that would test everything she had learned and everything she believed about herself. In her dreams, she was running through the desert landscapes of home, but this time she was not alone. Behind her followed a pack of Marines who had learned to trust the small wolf who led them through terrain that others found impossible to navigate. The real test was about to begin. The Afghan sunrise painted the mountains of Helmand province in shades of gold and amber, but there was no beauty in the moment for Lance Corporal Sarah Martinez. She crouched behind a mud brick wall, her rifle ready, as the sound of gunfire echoed across the valley below. This was her 4th month in country, and what had started as a routine patrol to check on a village school had turned into something much more serious. "Martinez, can you see the shooter?" Staff Sergeant Williams called out from his position 20 meters to her left. Sarah adjusted her scope and scanned the tree line where muzzle flashes had been spotted moments earlier. Her smaller frame allowed her to find concealment in spaces that larger Marines couldn't use effectively, and her patient observation skills had already proven valuable on previous patrols. "I see movement approximately 200 meters northeast of a large boulder," she reported into her radio. "At least 2 individuals, possibly more." The patrol had started before dawn with 8 Marines and 4 Afghan National Army soldiers. Their mission was to assess the security situation around a girls' school that had been receiving threats from Taliban forces in the area. It was exactly the kind of community engagement work that Sarah had hoped to be part of when she joined the Marines. But Afghanistan had a way of turning routine missions into life and death situations without warning. The first indication of trouble had come from Davis, who was walking 50 meters ahead of the main group. His voice had crackled through the radio with controlled urgency. "Possible IED marker ahead." "I'll stop." Sarah had immediately moved to her assigned overwatch position, while the explosive ordnance specialist examined what appeared to be a suspicious pile of rocks beside the dirt road. The examination revealed not an improvised explosive device, but something potentially more dangerous, signs that the area was under observation by hostile forces. That's when the shooting started. Now, 45 minutes into what tactical manuals called a complex ambush situation, Sarah found herself in the position she had trained for, but hoped never to experience. Real bullets were snapping overhead. Real explosives were detonating close enough to shower her with dirt and debris, and the decision she made in the next few minutes would determine whether her fellow Marines went home alive. "Williams, I can provide covering fire if Rodriguez and Chun can move to that building," Sarah called out, indicating a structure that would give the team better positioning. "Negative, Martinez. Too exposed. We need to call for support and hold position." But Sarah had been watching the enemy movement for several minutes now, and she could see something that Williams couldn't from his position. The Taliban fighters were attempting to flank the patrol, moving through a drainage ditch that would eventually put them behind the Marines' defensive positions. "Williams, they're flanking us through the irrigation ditch on the eastern side." If they complete that movement, we're going to be surrounded. There was a pause in the radio traffic as Williams processed this information. Sarah used the momentary lull to continue her observation, noting details that would be critical for any tactical decision. The enemy force appeared to be larger than initially estimated, at least 6 fighters, possibly more. They were well-equipped and disciplined, suggesting this wasn't a random encounter, but a planned ambush. Martinez, can you engage the flanking movement? Sarah studied the tactical situation carefully. The flanking force was moving through terrain that provided them with concealment, but also limited their options for retreat. If she could establish a firing position that controlled that avenue of approach, she could prevent them from completing their movement while the rest of the patrol dealt with the frontal threat. But reaching that firing position would require crossing open ground under enemy observation. In training exercises, such movement was challenging but manageable. Here, with real bullets and real consequences, it represented a significant risk that could result in her death or capture. I can do it, she replied, but I'll need covering fire for the movement. Martinez, that's a long movement across open ground. You sure about this? Sarah thought about the months of training that had brought her to this point, the desert exercises where she had learned to use terrain and patience to her advantage, the confidence that her fellow Marines had placed in her tactical judgment. But more than that, she thought about the school they had come to check on, filled with Afghan girls whose only chance for education depended on security that people like her could provide. I'm sure the movement across the open ground was the longest 100 meters of Sarah's life. Bullets snapped through the air around her as she bounded from one piece of cover to another, using techniques that had been drilled into her during countless training exercises but never tested under such extreme conditions. Her small size worked to her advantage here, allowing her to find concealment behind rocks and in depressions that wouldn't have hidden larger Marines. But size was less important than the mental toughness that kept her moving forward when every instinct screamed at her to find a hole and stay in it. When she finally reached her intended position, a low wall that overlooked the drainage ditch, Sarah was breathing hard and covered in dust, but she was exactly where she needed to be. The flanking force was now clearly visible, 6 Taliban fighters moving confidently through terrain they thought was unobserved. Sarah's grandmother had taught her that wolves were successful hunters not because they were the biggest predators, but because they were patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. As she settled her rifle and prepared to engage, Sarah embodied that patience. She waited until the lead fighter was completely exposed with no cover available, then began engaging the enemy force with carefully aimed shots that disrupted their movement and forced them to seek cover in positions that were tactically disadvantageous. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was decisive. The flanking movement was stopped, and the remaining enemy fighters began withdrawing under pressure from the rest of the Marine Patrol. When the shooting finally stopped and the area was secure, Staff Sergeant Williams approached Sarah's position with an expression that mixed relief, respect, and something approaching awe. Martinez, that was some of the finest tactical movement I've seen in 3 deployments. You probably saved all our lives. But Sarah was already thinking beyond the immediate tactical situation. The ambush had been sophisticated and well-planned, suggesting a level of enemy capability that posed ongoing threats to the local population. The school they had come to check on was now certainly a target for reprisal attacks. "We need to get to the village," she said. "If they knew about our patrol, they probably know about our mission." The village was a collection of mud brick buildings clustered around a central compound that housed both the school and a small medical clinic. When the Marine Patrol arrived, they found a scene that confirmed Sarah's concerns. The school had been evacuated, but not voluntarily. Bullet holes in the walls and scattered books in the courtyard told the story of intimidation and threats designed to drive away both teachers and students. The headmaster, an elderly Afghan man named Ahmad, met the Marines with a mixture of relief and resignation. Through their interpreter, Ahmad explained that Taliban fighters had visited the school the previous night with a simple message: continue educating girls and face the consequences. The threat had been reinforced by the ambush of the Marine Patrol, demonstrating that the Taliban had both the intent and capability to enforce their demands. Sarah found herself deeply affected by the situation. The school represented everything she believed the military mission in Afghanistan was supposed to accomplish, providing security that allowed people to build better lives for their children. Seeing that mission threatened by forces that used violence to suppress education, particularly for girls, touched something fundamental in her sense of purpose. "What can we do to help?" she asked Ahmad through the interpreter. The old man's response was immediate and direct. The school needed consistent security presence to operate safely. Without protection, the teachers would stop coming and the students would be denied education. But the Afghan National Army unit assigned to the area was too small and poorly equipped to provide that protection alone. Over the next several hours, Sarah found herself taking an unofficial leadership role in developing a solution. She worked with the Afghan Army soldiers to assess defensive positions around the school, identified potential improvements to security procedures, and helped plan patrol routes that would provide coverage without being predictable. Her ability to communicate effectively with the Afghan soldiers impressed everyone, including Williams. Despite language barriers, she managed to convey tactical concepts and coordinate planning through a combination of basic Pashto phrases, hand signals, and simple diagrams drawn in the dirt. "How is she doing that?" Rodriguez asked Davis as they watched Sarah working with the Afghan soldiers. "Same way she does everything else," Davis replied. "She figures out what needs to be done and find a way to make it work." But the real test of Sarah's leadership came that evening, when intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces were planning another attack on the school. This time, the threat was not just intimidation, but destruction of the building itself. Williams called together his Marines and the Afghan army leaders to plan their response. As the most senior Marine, he would normally take the lead in such planning. But the tactical situation was complex, involving coordination between American and Afghan forces, protection of civilian infrastructure, and potential engagement with enemy forces in an urban environment. "Martinez," Williams said after reviewing the intelligence, "you've been working most closely with the Afghan soldiers, and you know this terrain better than anyone else. I want your assessment of how we should handle this." It was an extraordinary moment, a staff sergeant asking a lance corporal to take the lead in mission planning. But it was also recognition of what Sarah had proven over the past several months, that effective leadership had more to do with competence and judgment than rank or seniority. Sarah studied the maps and considered the tactical challenges they faced. The school was positioned in a valley that provided limited fields of fire and multiple approaches for attacking forces. The Afghan army soldiers were brave, but lacked the training and equipment of the Marines. The civilian population in the area could complicate any engagement, but Sarah also saw opportunities that others might miss. The terrain that limited their defensive fields of fire also constrained the attackers' options. The local population, grateful for the Marines' protection of the school, could provide intelligence about enemy movement. Most importantly, the Taliban forces, expecting to face only poorly equipped Afghan soldiers, would be unprepared for the tactical sophistication that a combined force could bring to the defense. Sarah's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to defend the school directly, they would use it as bait to draw the attacking force into a pre-planned kill zone where Marines and Afghan soldiers could engage them from concealed positions with overlapping fields of fire. The plan required precise timing, excellent communication between American and Afghan forces, and the kind of tactical patience that Sarah had learned from her grandmother's stories about wolves waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the Taliban attack came shortly after midnight, everything unfolded exactly as Sarah had predicted. Enemy forces approached the school expecting minimal resistance, only to find themselves caught in a carefully constructed ambush that neutralized the threat while minimizing risk to the defending forces. By dawn, the battle was over. The Taliban force had been defeated, The school was secure, and the message had been sent that attacks on educational facilities would be met with decisive resistance. As the Marines prepared to return to their base, Ahmad approached Sarah through the interpreter with a request that surprised everyone. "He wants to know your name," the interpreter said. "Not your military name, but what your family calls you." "Sarah," she replied. "My family calls me Sarah." Ahmad nodded and spoke again. The interpreter smiled before translating. He says from now on, when the children ask who protected their school, he will tell them about Sarah, the wolf warrior who came from across the ocean to ensure they could learn. As the patrol made its way back through the mountains of Helmand Province, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from the nervous recruit who had stepped off the bus at Camp Pendleton less than a year ago. She had proven that strength came in many forms, that leadership was about competence rather than size, and that a small woman from New Mexico could make a difference in one of the world's most challenging environments. But more than personal achievement, she had participated in something larger, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, defending values like education and opportunity that transcended national boundaries, and proving that military force, when used wisely and with precision, could create space for hope to flourish. The nickname Iron Wolf had evolved from joke to recognition to something approaching legend among the Marines in her unit. But Sarah understood that the real meaning of the name had nothing to do with her reputation and everything to do with the qualities that had made her effective: patience, intelligence, adaptability, and unwavering commitment to the Marines beside her and the mission they shared. As the Afghan mountains gave way to the familiar landscape of their forward operating base, Sarah Martinez knew that she had found her place not just in the Marines, but in a tradition of warriors who understood that true strength came not from size or aggression, but from the courage to do what was right when doing wrong would be easier. The girl who had once been dismissed as too small to be a real Marine had become something else entirely. A leader whose judgment was trusted in the most critical situations, a tactician whose innovations saved lives, and a Marine whose example proved that excellence came in many forms. In her pack, she carried letters from home that reminded her of where she had come from and what she was fighting for. But in her heart, she carried something even more valuable: the knowledge that she had earned her place among the finest warriors her country could produce, not despite her differences, but because of them. The Iron Wolf had found her pack, and her pack had found a leader who would never let them down.